The trip. Dad, are you trying to die in this truck? Rain hammered the windshield hard enough to flatten the view outside into streaks of gray and white. The rest stop in Montana was almost empty. Just a few long-haul trucks farther down the lot and a dirty ridge of snow shoved against the curb. Sarah stood in front of Walter's pickup with her coat half-zipped, hair wet against her face, both hands braced on the hood, as if anger were the only thing keeping her upright. She looked like she had been driving for hours, maybe all night. Walter sat behind the wheel with one hand resting on the black notebook on his lap, and for a second, he did not answer her at all. Walter Mercer was 75, a retired aerospace engineer from Bellevue, Washington, a man who trusted measurements more than moods and habit more than hope. By the time his daughter found him at a rest stop in Montana, he had already sold his house, bought an old truck, and turned a private fear into a practical plan. 3 weeks earlier, none of that had existed in the open. There had only been a funeral, a mild pain in his chest, and a quiet decision to begin counting what time he might have left. He pressed the button to unlock the passenger door. The locks clicked. Sarah stared at him through the rain. "I'm asking you a real question." Walter looked at her a moment longer, then reached across and pushed the door open from inside. Cold air rushed in with the rain. She climbed up into the cab without thanking him, slammed the door shut, and sat there breathing hard, water shining on the shoulders of her coat. He turned off the wipers. The sudden stillness made the rain louder. 3 weeks earlier, Walter came home from Ed Harper's funeral and hung his coat over the back of a kitchen chair instead of putting it in the closet. He left it there. The house in Bellevue was quiet in the expensive, sealed way newer houses were quiet. Nothing rattled, nothing leaked. The refrigerator hummed softly. The heat came on with a click in the vents. Outside, late winter light lay flat over the yard and the neighboring roofs, colorless and thin. He set the folded funeral program on the counter, filled the kettle, and put it on the stove. Then he went to the junk drawer, took out an old HP calculator, and carried it with a legal pad and a mechanical pencil to the kitchen table. He had used that table for drafting once, years ago, before everything lived inside a screen. After Ellen died, it had turned into a place for taxes, insurance forms, and unopened mail he meant to sort on Sundays. Now the surface was clear except for a fruit bowl with 3 clementines softening at the bottom. Walter sat down and wrote 4 names: Ed Harper, Lou Sutter, Manny Ruiz, Phil Jameson. He added their ages at death beside them. Then he entered the numbers into the calculator and pressed average. 76 on I. He looked at the result as if the device had given him something objective. It had not, of course. 4 men were not a sample size. 4 old Boeing men from the same generation, the same region, the same habits of bad coffee and deferred checkups told him almost nothing. But their deaths had lined up too neatly in his mind to ignore. Lou with the stroke in the Safeway parking lot. Manny with the cancer that had apparently been there for months before anyone saw it. Phil dead on a golf course. Ed, stubborn and careful, who had listened to every doctor, kept every appointment, and still gone under 9 months after diagnosis. Walter got up when the kettle started to rattle. He made tea, waited for it to steep, and checked the clock above the microwave. 3:42. On the pad beneath the names, he wrote, "First chest pain, 19 days ago." He stared at that line. The pain had not been dramatic. He had been carrying 2 bags of mulch from the garage to the side yard when something tightened under his breastbone. Not sharp exactly, just firm enough to stop him in place. He had set the bags down beside the hydrangeas and waited, looking at nothing. The episode lasted perhaps 40 seconds, a minute at most. Then it passed. He finished what he was doing and told no one. At the table, he adjusted the lamp overhead so the light fell directly on the page. He liked clean visibility. On the next sheet, he wrote the numbers 1 through 12. For a while, he only sat there. The house around him felt orderly enough to continue indefinitely. The tea steamed beside his hand. Somewhere down the block, a leaf blower started and stopped. A dog barked twice. The ordinary day stayed ordinary, which irritated him. At line 1, he wrote, "Drive to Alaska, see the aurora borealis." That had been in his head since he was 19. Back then, it had belonged to another category of life. The category where time extended far enough that not doing something now did not mean not doing it at all. The next items came easier. Go back through Glacier National Park one more time. Return Ed's tool chest to his son. Sort the garage so Sarah does not have to. See the Tillamook Air Museum. He kept going until he reached the 12th line. There he stopped. The pencil hovered. He tapped it once against the table, then lowered it. Tell Sarah I love her. He disliked the sentence as soon as he saw it. Not because it was false, because it was soft on the page in a way that made him distrust it. Still, he left it there. 2 days later, he sat on the paper-covered exam table in Dr. Andrew Williams' office with his shirt open under the drape and his shoes lined up beneath him. Williams studied the chart on the computer screen. He was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, with the tired efficiency of a man used to carrying bad news in measured doses. Walter had known him long enough to trust his competence, if not his tendency to overstate urgency. "You should have come in sooner," Williams said. "It wasn't persistent." "That is not the point." Walter waited. Williams turned on the stool to face him. "Your murmur is more pronounced than it was last year. I'm not getting enough from the EKG alone. I want an echocardiogram, blood work, and a cardiology referral." "For what specifically?" Williams folded his hands once, then unfolded them. "I'm concerned about aortic stenosis." Walter knew the term. Narrowing of the valve, restricted flow, increased strain. He had spent enough of his life around systems under stress to dislike the phrase immediately. "How concerned?" Concerned enough that I want this moved quickly." Walter nodded as if they were talking about a service interval. Williams looked at him for a beat too long. "Most people ask whether it's treatable." "Is it?" "Yes," Williams said, "and depending on severity. In mild cases, we monitor. In more serious cases, we talk about valve replacement." He paused. "The problem is people like to wait until their body makes the decision for them." Walter slipped off the table and reached for his shirt. "I'm here, aren't I?" "You're here for information," Williams said. "I'm not sure yet you're here for help." That landed close enough to the truth to annoy him. Walter buttoned his shirt slowly. "I prefer actual numbers before people start rearranging my life." Williams handed him the printed orders. "Get me the numbers then, but don't mistake delay for control." Walter took the papers. "Noted." In the parking garage after the echocardiogram, he sat in his car and did not start the engine. The technician had said almost nothing, which he knew meant nothing and felt like something. She had moved the probe across his chest with professional neutrality while looking at the monitor in a way that suggested she had already seen whatever there was to see. He opened the folder. Appointment summaries, lab slips, a cardiology name, the machinery of process. His phone buzzed. Leah Chen had returned his earlier voicemail. Walter answered, "This is Walter Mercer." "Mr. Mercer, Leah Chen, sorry I missed you. I understand you're considering selling your home." "Yes." "All right." Her voice was polished, efficient, with the kind of warmth that never became personal by accident. "Are you looking for a traditional timeline or something faster?" "Faster." "How fast?" He looked through the windshield at the concrete wall striped with moisture. "I'd prefer not to spend 6 months discussing throw pillows." A short laugh. She understood the type. "We can keep it very clean. Minimal prep, competitive pricing, possibly an off-market buyer if that suits you." "Cash would suit me." "All right," she said. "Can I see the house tomorrow?" "Yes." "Will anyone else be involved in decisions?" "No." The word came out too quickly. Leah was quiet just long enough for him to hear it. Then she said, "Understood. I'll send a calendar invite." When he got home the next day, Leah was already in the driveway, standing beside a dark blue Lexus and looking up at the roofline. She wore a camel coat, low heels that made no sound on the front walk, and an expression of complete professional readiness. Inside the house, she moved from room to room, making notes on a tablet, pausing only to ask questions about age of appliances, sewer line history, roof replacement, HOA documents. She was not nosy, she was thorough. "This will move," she said in the kitchen, "especially if you're willing to price for speed." "I am." "You understand that speed costs money. So does waiting." She glanced at him then, more directly than before. "Are you relocating locally?" For now, she did not challenge the vagueness. "Do you have family nearby?" "A daughter in Redmond." "Will she need to sign anything?" "No," Leah nodded. "Then I'll prepare the listing package." He appreciated that she did not say, "Should she know?" Sarah found out anyway. The call came while he was standing at the kitchen counter, reading an email notification from the clinic portal, telling him preliminary results would be posted soon. He answered on the 4th ring. "Leah Chen called me," Sarah said. "No, hello." Walter turned and leaned one hip against the counter. "Did she?" "Yes, she did." He could hear movement behind her. Cupboard doors, maybe, or classroom noise fading from a speakerphone she had just disconnected. Her voice was sharp in the way it got when she was trying very hard not to sound scared. "She said she's listing your house. Were you planning to mention that yourself?" "It's preliminary." "You don't list a house as a preliminary thought." People said things like that to him more often now, as if age had turned every decision into a symptom. "I'm exploring options," he said. "Why?" He rubbed a thumb along the edge of the counter. "Because it's my house." That is not an answer. It is the answer. A pause. Then, more quietly, did the doctor find something? Walter looked at the clinic email on the screen. Nothing there yet but a link and a password prompt. They're running tests. Dad. He disliked the note in her voice because it belonged partly to the present and partly to every earlier version of her he had disappointed by withholding things until they became irreversible. It's just a trip, Sarah, he said. A trip where? North. That's not funny. I'm not joking. Another pause, tighter now. Why would you need to sell the house to take a trip? He almost said, because I may not come back to it long enough to justify keeping it. Instead, he said, I don't need this much house. That wasn't true last month. Last month is over. She let out a breath that sounded like it hurt. Can you, for once, just tell me what's going on before I hear about it from somebody else? He looked at the black notebook lying on the table where he had left it open that morning. The list was tucked inside the cover, hidden and not hidden. Before he could answer, the clinic portal refreshed. A new message appeared. He opened it. Preliminary findings consistent with severe aortic stenosis. The rest of the language blurred for a second, then sharpened again. Severe, calcific, cardiology follow-up recommended urgently. He felt no dramatic drop inside himself. No cinematic recognition, only a hard internal settling like a component locking into place. Sarah was still on the line. Dad? Walter clicked into another browser tab and completed the transfer for the used Ford F-150 he had found in Yakima the night before. Deposit received, the page confirmed. Hold pending pickup. Then he said, I'll call you later. No, don't do that, don't. He ended the call. 2 minutes later, Leah sent the listing agreement. He signed it electronically without rereading the price. 3 minutes after that, Sarah called again. He answered. This time she did not circle. Why are you selling the house? Walter stood very still in the center of the kitchen. The room looked the same as it had an hour earlier. Clean counters, closed cabinets, the funeral program from Ed's service still folded near the lamp. But the house had already begun to shift in his mind from shelter to asset, from place to item, on a sequence. His fingers rested on the black notebook. I'm taking a trip, he said. To where? He ended the call before she could ask anything else. North. By the time Walter crossed into British Columbia, the first rush of the trip had settled into something cleaner and more practical. The truck had a long crack in the dashboard, a smell of old fabric and cold metal, and a radio that drifted in and out depending on the bends in the road. None of that bothered him. The heater worked. The engine sounded steady. The gas gauge moved slower than he had expected. That was enough. At the border, the younger officer had glanced at his passport, then at Walter, then at the black notebook on the passenger seat, as if trying to decide what kind of old man drove north alone in March. Purpose of your trip? Driving. The officer had waited. Tourism, Walter said. How long will you be in Canada? A few days. Any firearms, alcohol, cannabis? No. The officer handed back the passport. All right, safe travels. Walter nodded once and drove on. For the first hour after that, he felt almost absurdly good. It embarrassed him slightly, the degree of it. His hands sat comfortably at 10 and 2, though no one drove that way anymore. Pine and wet rocks slid past beyond the guardrail. Low clouds dragged over the mountains. The road opened and narrowed and opened again. He bought coffee in a paper cup at a gas station outside Hope and took it black because adding cream in a parking lot meant one more thing to spill. The woman at the register had a pink bandage over one finger and a tired face that improved briefly when he thanked her. On a rack by the door, faded postcards showed summer lakes that did not resemble the cold, wet world outside. Back in the truck, he unfolded the old road atlas he had bought at a drugstore in Bellevue 2 days earlier, though the phone on the dash already showed him the route. He liked seeing distance as a shape. He traced the line north with one finger, through places whose names he only half knew, farther than he had driven in years, farther than Sarah would guess if she tried to estimate where he'd gone. That gave him a small, private satisfaction. The radio found an oldies station for almost 40 miles. Credence, then Fleetwood Mac, then Static. He drove with the window cracked half an inch to keep the cab from fogging. Cold air threaded in and carried the smell of wet trees and diesel from passing trucks. He liked the sense of movement, the clean inconvenience of it. Gas, coffee, windshield wash fluid, the next motel, problems with edges, problems a person could solve by pulling over, getting out, using his hands. Around noon, he stopped at a roadside viewpoint above a river the color of slate. The parking lot was mostly empty except for an RV and a pickup with snowmobiles strapped in the back. He climbed down from the truck, straightened, and immediately felt the wrongness in his left knee. Not a twinge, not a warning, a bright, hot line of pain under the kneecap when he put weight on it. He stood still. The cold sharpened everything. Water hissed below over rocks he could not see. A gust pressed against his jacket. He took another step toward the railing, and the knee objected again, harder this time, enough to make him grab the truck door with one hand. "Jesus Christ," he said aloud, though there was no one close enough to hear. He stayed where he was until the first flare subsided. Then he walked carefully to the overlook anyway, because he had already gotten out, and because returning to the driver's seat without reaching the railing felt, in some small, stupid way, like surrender. By the time he reached it, he was annoyed enough to forget the river entirely for several seconds. It was not a dramatic injury. No swelling he could see through his jeans. No twist, no fall. Just pain. The sort of thing that would once have earned a few muttered curses and then a day or two of ibuprofen and yard work. Now it introduced itself differently. Now every new malfunction arrived with an implied argument. Back in the truck, he sat with the door open and flexed the joint carefully. It moved. Stiff, but intact. He drove another 30 miles before stopping at a pharmacy and buying acetaminophen, ibuprofen, a travel tube of menthol cream, and a knee brace that looked too flimsy to be worth the packaging. The cashier was a college-age boy with acne along his jaw and a bored expression that sharpened only when Walter declined the loyalty number prompt 3 times. "You want a bag?" "No." The boy glanced at the items. "That knee brace runs small." "It'll do." In the parking lot, Walter opened the bottle and took more ibuprofen than the label recommended for a man his age on an empty stomach. He knew that. He did it anyway. Then he sat in the truck with the heater on and watched sleet begin to strike the windshield in fine diagonal lines. His phone showed 4 missed calls from Sarah. He listened to none of them. Instead, he opened email. The new message from Dr. Williams had arrived 40 minutes earlier. "Walter, the echocardiogram findings are concerning for severe aortic stenosis. This is not something I'm comfortable having you sit on, especially if you are traveling alone. My office has been trying to reach you to schedule urgent follow-up with cardiology for surgical evaluation. Please call today. I strongly recommend you return home as soon as possible." There was more below that. Phone numbers, references to symptom escalation, instructions about chest pain, shortness of breath, syncope. Walter read the message twice, then closed the laptop. He sat for another minute with his hands resting on the steering wheel. The problem with men like Williams, he thought, not entirely fairly, was that once they had a language for risk, they treated every hour afterward as a countdown belonging to them. Return home as soon as possible. Surgical evaluation. Do not travel alone. It all came from the same world that wanted signatures in the correct boxes and follow-up appointments scheduled before the first one ended. Efficient, sensible. Designed to move a person onto rails. He started the truck. The road north narrowed and widened by turns, threading past truck stops, logging yards, frozen shoulders, low motels with vacancy signs buzzing in daylight. The mountains came closer, then fell back. Sometimes there was a lake or a long cut through rock where snow clung in dirty patches to the blasted face of the hill. Sometimes only miles of spruce and the smeared glow of an approaching semi in weather that kept changing its mind. By late afternoon, his knee had stiffened enough that getting in and out of the truck became a sequence to plan rather than an ordinary motion. He began choosing stops for their nearness to the door. At a gas station outside Prince George, he parked beside the entrance and sat for a moment after killing the engine, studying the wet pavement below as if he might negotiate with it. Inside, the coffee smelled scorched. A woman in a quilted vest stood in front of the hot food case, arguing politely with the clerk about whether the soup was still all right from lunch. "It's been under heat," the clerk said. "It's got that skin on top." "That happens." Walter took a black coffee and a wrapped turkey sandwich that had gone slightly damp inside the plastic. At the register, the woman in the vest looked over at his knee brace while he counted out bills. "Those things any good?" she asked. He followed her gaze. "Not so far." She gave a short snort of recognition. "Ain't that always it?" Outside, he ate half the sandwich in the truck. The bread stuck to his teeth. The coffee was terrible and hot enough to count as useful. He checked the map again, then booked a roadside motel from his phone because the light was going flat, and the knee had become less of an annoyance than a condition. The motel stood beside the highway, behind a lot full of plowed snow, the color of old cement. The room smelled faintly of bleach and something sweet underneath, the residue of too many air fresheners. The bedspread had a geometric pattern in burgundy and green that might have been old enough to vote. A humming mini-fridge sat under the television cabinet. When Walter stepped out of his boots, his sock on the left side was damp where slush had splashed over the heel. He sat on the edge of the bed to remove the knee brace and had to pause halfway down because bending the joint sent another clean bright streak through the front of it. He swore softly and waited it out. On the nightstand, his phone vibrated again. Sarah. This time he answered, mostly to stop the repetition. Where are you? She said. No greeting, no attempt at pretending this was a normal call. Walter leaned back against the motel headboard. It was too soft and bounced slightly under his weight. North. Oh, good, still with that. What do you want me to say, Sarah? The truth would be a nice variation. Rain or sleet rattled against the window unit. On the television across the room, muted by default, a local news anchor moved her lips soundlessly over a weather map. Walter said, I'm driving. I know you're driving. Leah told me the house has showings scheduled. Dr. Williams' office called my emergency contact number because apparently you're ignoring them now, too. He said nothing. Her breath caught, not quite a sob, more an interruption in the machinery of speech. Did they tell you not to go? They told me to come back. And I heard them. That is not the same thing. Walter rubbed one hand over his knee, feeling the warmth it still held from the brace. You are speaking as if I've driven into a war zone. What I'm speaking as is the person who gets a call from your doctor saying your condition may be serious, and another call from a realtor saying you're liquidating your life. The phrase irritated him on sight. I'm not liquidating my life. What would you call it? He looked around the motel room. The chipped laminate dresser, the Gideon Bible in the drawer left partly open by some prior guest, the cup wrapped in plastic beside the sink. He could smell the bleach again, stronger now that the room had warmed. He felt tired in the flat physical way driving gave him, but underneath it something harder, a stubbornness so old it had outlived usefulness. I'd call it making use of my time, he said. She was quiet for a second, then more controlled than before. Are you in pain? He almost lied. Nothing unmanageable? What does that mean? My knee's acting up. Your knee. Her voice sharpened again. That's what you lead with right now. It's the thing currently bothering me. He heard her move on the other end, perhaps pacing. Dad, listen to me for once. I'm not trying to manage your life. I just need to know whether you are actually safe. He looked at the black notebook on the bed beside him. Earlier, after check-in, he had taken it from the truck and placed it there almost automatically, as if he were setting a watch or wallet within reach. I'm in a motel, he said. The door locks. There's heat. I've had dinner. That's not what I meant. I know. The line stayed open between them. Then Sarah said lower now. You always do this. He waited. You decide something alone. You finish half of it before anyone else even knows there was a decision. And then when I ask what's happening, you act like I'm overreacting. Her voice did not rise at the end. That made it worse. Walter looked down at his hands. The skin over the knuckles had thinned in recent years. He had not noticed when exactly that happened. This isn't about you, he said. The moment he said it, he knew it was the wrong sentence. Not because it was false, exactly. Because it was the sentence that always made things narrower instead of clearer. Sarah laughed once, a dry, ugly sound. You really think that helps? He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. Fatigue moved through him in a slow wave. I am not asking you to approve this. That's convenient. I'm asking you to let me finish a trip. A trip to where? He looked toward the curtain, though there was nothing to see beyond the reflected room. Alaska. The silence after that felt total. When she spoke again, she sounded not calmer but more careful. Why Alaska? He could have told her the cleaned-up version. The old wish. The northern lights. A place he had postponed too long. All of that was true enough. None of it was the whole thing. I wanted to go, he said. That's it? Yes. Dad. He did not answer. Finally, she said, if you pass out alone somewhere, do you understand that it won't feel noble to me? It'll just feel like one more thing you decided I had to live with afterward. Walter stared at the carpet. It had a cigarette burn near the bathroom door. He had not noticed it before. Get some sleep, he said. Don't do that. But he had already ended the call. He did sleep badly. The room was too warm, then too cold, and every time he turned, his left knee woke first, objecting before the rest of him understood what had happened. At 3 a.m, he got up to use the bathroom and had to stand with one hand on the sink until the stiffness eased enough for him to walk back. In the mirror, he looked exactly like what he was. An old man in a motel, halfway up the continent, face creased from poor sleep, gray hair flattened on one side, t-shirt hanging loose at the collarbone. Nothing dramatic, nothing tragic, just older than his private calculations had preferred. At dawn, he checked the weather and the route, swallowed more pills with lukewarm water, and went back out. The next 2 days became a pattern of distance and correction. He drove longer than was wise while the road was open, then had to make up for it later with slower exits from the truck, longer pauses at gas pumps, more care lowering himself onto diner stools. He bought a cane at a general store in a town whose name he forgot an hour later. It was aluminum, adjustable, ugly. He told himself it was temporary and put it in the passenger footwell where he could deny using it unless someone saw. In a diner with mounted fish on knotty pine walls, a waitress called him honey and refilled his coffee before he asked. Her accent pinned her somewhere local, clipped and practical. "You headed all the way up?" she asked, nodding toward the window and the loaded truck outside. "That's the plan." She glanced at his brace as she set down the check. "Roads long to do hurt, I've noticed." She gave him the kind of look service workers gave customers who were making choices beyond comment. Not approval, not disapproval, just measurement. "Well, good soup for the road if you want something packed." He almost said no, then he said yes. In the truck again, he found another voicemail from Sarah and listened to it this time. "Dad, call me back. I'm serious. I don't care if you're mad, just call." The next one was later, more tired. "If you're doing this because you think you're saving me trouble, you're not. You're just moving the trouble farther away." He did not play the third. He crossed into Alaska under a sky so pale it was almost metallic. Snow still lined the edges of the road in long, compressed banks, though the pavement itself was clear. The sign appeared without ceremony, as most important things did. A pullout, a handful of vehicles, the state flag whipping hard in the wind, the big welcome sign half-rimmed with old ice. Walter parked crooked the first time, corrected, killed the engine, and sat with both hands on the wheel. His heart was beating too fast. Not from sentiment, he told himself. From the last stretch of road, from caffeine, from the awkward effort of driving with the knee half stiff and the rest of him compensating around it. Still, he waited a moment longer before opening the door. The cold hit him at once, a real northern cold with structure to it, not just low temperature, but force. It entered through the collar, the cuffs, the seam where his gloves did not quite meet his sleeves. He reached down for the cane, hesitated, then took it anyway. The parking lot was a mix of packed snow and wet gravel. A family in matching knit hats was taking turns posing in front of the sign, while a teenager rolled his eyes and held a phone. A trucker smoked beside his rig, one elbow lifted against the wind. Nobody paid Walter much attention. He stepped down from the cab. The knee resisted immediately. Not collapse, not failure, but refusal. Each step from the truck to the sign had to be negotiated with the rest of his body. Foot placement, weight shift, cane, then leg, a ridiculous little engineering problem imposed by flesh. He moved through it. By the time he reached the edge of the lot, breathing felt less straightforward than it had 20 minutes ago. Not panic, not even quite shortness of breath, just the sense that his chest had become an older machine than the one he'd started this journey with, one that now required a little more time between demands. He stopped beside a low barrier facing the wide white distance beyond the road. Mountains stood farther off under the thin sun, enormous and uninterested. The air had a still brightness to it despite the wind, as if everything visible had been stripped down to ice, rock, and light. Alaska. He did not feel triumphant. He felt present in a way he had not for months. The place was there, so was he. That was enough to complicate things. After a while, he went back to the truck, slower than before, and lowered himself into the driver's seat with care bordering on calculation. His hands were stiff from the cold even inside the gloves. When he took them off, his fingers looked pale and slightly swollen at the joints. He reached for the black notebook. The cover was colder than he expected, and he opened to the list. 1. Drive to Alaska. See the aurora borealis. Not done yet. Alaska, yes. Aurora, not yet. Still, the line no longer belonged to the category of fantasy. It had weight now. Mileage, fuel receipts, pills in the glove box, a motel key with a cracked plastic tag, a cane he disliked, pain he had not budgeted for. Outside, the family finished taking pictures and piled back into their SUV. The trucker flicked away his cigarette and climbed into his cab. Wind shook the sign once, hard enough to make the metal groan faintly. Walter took out his pen and drew one careful line through the word drive. He stopped there. His hand was shaking, a little from the cold, a little from the effort of standing out there, and a little from something less easy to sort. Excitement, perhaps. Or the uneven pulse in his throat that had followed him the last half hour and had not yet settled into anything he trusted. He rested the pen against the page until the shake passed enough to write again, but it did not pass. It only changed rhythm. So he closed the notebook on the unfinished line and sat very still in the parking lot at the edge of Alaska, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, as if the next item on the list might be negotiated the same way the road had been, one correction at a time. Worth the drive. By the time the sky finally cleared, Walter had begun to suspect the northern lights might turn into one more thing people sold each other with photographs. All in that afternoon, the cloud cover had dragged low and solid across the horizon. He had driven farther than he meant to, then doubled back to a state recreation pullout a man at a gas station had mentioned outside talk. If it opens up tonight, you'll see it from there. The man had said it while ringing up a thermos of coffee and a breakfast burrito under a heat lamp, in the tone of someone offering weather, not magic. Now, near 10:30, Walter stood beside the truck in 2 pairs of socks and a winter jacket that had been adequate in Washington and only barely qualified here. The parking area was mostly gravel buried under packed snow, the edges lit faintly by a moon not yet fully out. Farther back, dark spruce trees formed a dense wall. Beyond the road, there was only a low white spread of open ground and then distance. The cold was organized. It found the weak seams first, cuffs, collar, the strip of skin between glove and sleeve when he lifted the thermos. His left knee had stiffened badly after dinner, enough that climbing down from the truck had required forethought. He'd taken the cane without argument this time. The metal tip clicked against frozen gravel while he moved a few yards away from the vehicle to escape its reflected light. His breath showed pale in front of him, then vanished. Somewhere beyond the trees, a truck passed on the highway, the sound long and low and strangely soft in the cold. Otherwise, there was very little. No campers talking, no doors slamming, no human activity close enough to join him in it. He waited because waiting at least was still a thing he knew how to do. The first sign of change was so slight he thought he had imagined it. A pale band above the tree line, not bright enough to count as light, only a thinning of darkness. He narrowed his eyes. It remained. Then, while he was still looking directly at it, the band lifted and widened. A color not easy to name. Green, yes, but thinned with gray and distance, as if the sky itself were lit from behind by something mechanical and vast. Walter stood very still. The band became a curve. The curve unfastened itself and spread. A second ribbon appeared higher up, then another, and the whole northern stretch of sky began moving in silence. Not fast, not theatrical, but moving unmistakably, folding and unfolding in long, soft planes of light that seemed too large to belong to weather. He had seen pictures his whole life. Calendars, travel magazines, museum posters, computer screensavers in other people's offices. None of them had explained scale. None had explained the odd plainness of seeing it with his own eyes. Not ecstasy, not revelation, simply the fact of something real and remote operating above him without any interest in being witnessed. The green deepened. For a few seconds, a seam of violet touched one edge and disappeared. He laughed once under his breath from sheer surprise. The sound came out thin in the air. "Well," he said, though there was no one there. "All right, then." His chest was already working harder than it should have been, but so was everything now. The knee hurt. The cold needled his ears despite the hat. His fingers inside the gloves had started to ache. None of it canceled the sky. He stayed longer than was comfortable. At some point, he became aware that he was leaning too much onto the cane. His weight shifted off the left leg, neck tipped back farther than his balance preferred. He made himself step carefully toward the truck and brace one hand on the hood. The metal burned with cold through the glove. Above the windshield, the lights were still moving, widening and narrowing in an indifferent green wash, like curtains breathing. He should have gotten back into the cab immediately. Warmed up, sat down. Instead, he stood there another minute, unwilling to trade the full view for glass. For the first time since leaving Washington, the list in the black notebook did not seem ridiculous to him. Not practical, not efficient, not sensible. Ridiculous had never meant any of those things anyway. It meant private, sentimental, the sort of thing he would once have mocked gently in someone else and refused absolutely in himself. But the sky did not care whether he respected it. It was there. He had come. The trip had stopped being an argument and become a fact. When the pain hit, it was so abrupt that at first he thought the cold had simply reached deeper into him. It began under the breastbone, with the same tightness as before, only stronger and wrong in a different register, as if something inside his chest had cinched down with both hands. He straightened instinctively, then bent slightly forward because straightening made it worse. The cane slipped on the packed snow and caught again. He stayed beside the truck, one hand flat on the hood, waiting for the wave to pass. It did not pass. The pressure spread upward into his throat, not choking exactly, but present there and across toward his left shoulder in a dull, advancing band. His breath shortened. Not panic, he told himself. Just the body reducing the terms under which it would cooperate. Cold air entered too sharply. He tried taking smaller breaths. That helped nothing. Walter opened the driver's door and lowered himself into the seat with a level of care that would have looked absurd if anyone had been watching. The cab felt instantly cramped and stale. The thermos rolled in the passenger footwell when he pulled his leg in. He shut the door with more force than he intended and sat leaning forward, forearms braced on his thighs, waiting. The phone lay in the center console where he had left it. Screen dark. Signal weak but present. 1 bar, sometimes 2, enough. He knew exactly what Williams would say. He knew the laminated poster version too. Chest pain, pressure, shortness of breath. Call 911. In Alaska, perhaps not 911, perhaps local emergency. Perhaps a wait measured in weather and road conditions rather than minutes. Still, the mechanism existed. He was not beyond reach. The pressure sharpened again, and for several seconds, the only thing in the world was the fact that his body had become both immediate and unfamiliar. His heart did not feel like a pump then. It felt like something large and imprecise inside a space that had narrowed around it. He put one hand over the phone, then he took it away. Calling would begin a sequence. Questions, location, symptoms, an ambulance or trooper or local responder, a hospital somewhere under fluorescent light, monitoring, transfer. Sarah notified by somebody efficient and calm. Williams vindicated from several thousand miles away. The trip over, not by weather or lack of nerve, but by conversion. One moment of pain, and he would become what everybody had been trying to make him, a patient in transit, a man moved from system to system according to the urgency attached to his failing parts. The pain rose again, strong enough this time to blur the edges of the windshield. He closed his eyes. This was not bravery. He knew that even inside it. Bravery required a witness, or at least an idea of principle. This was narrower, meaner. He did not want to be carried backward now that he had come this far. He did not want the first completed item on the list to dissolve into a medical event narrated by other people. The phone remained within reach. He did not pick it up. Instead, he reached, after a clumsy moment, for the black notebook on the passenger seat. It took him 2 tries because his left hand felt briefly less reliable than usual. He dragged the notebook onto his lap, found the pen tucked in the cover, and flipped to the list. The motion aggravated the pressure in his chest. He paused, breathing shallowly, until the worst of it eased by a degree. Then on the page beneath item 1, in handwriting rougher than he liked, he wrote, "If tonight, then item 1 completed." He stared at the sentence. It looked absurdly like a note from work, the kind attached to a revision set or test failure. Too clipped, too cold. He added another line beneath it. Aurora visible from turnout east of Talk, 10:47 p.m. Then, after a moment, pain episode severe, did not call. The pen tip hovered above the page. He could feel his own pulse in his throat. Not rapid exactly, but uneven. A catch in it now and then that made him aware of time as a thing, arriving 1 beat at a time instead of in the steady background flow he preferred. Outside the windshield, the green light still moved over the treetops. He sat there bent over the notebook until the pressure finally began to loosen. Not vanish, loosen. The band in his chest shifted from vice to bruise, from immediate threat to residue. His breathing lengthened enough that he could take 1 full breath, then another. Sweat cooled under his shirt despite the cold. His hands smelled faintly metallic from the steering wheel and ink. He set the pen down carefully. For a while he did nothing else. The truck engine was off. The silence inside the cab felt padded and unnatural, as if he had been sealed in a box left out under the sky. A small crack of ice sounded somewhere on the windshield. From a few spaces away came the low idle of another vehicle, someone else waiting out there in the dark for the lights, unaware that the old man in the next truck had just declined to hand himself over. When he finally started the engine, his fingers shook enough that he missed the key position once. Warm air took too long to come through the vents. He should have driven to a clinic, an ER, any lit place with people and machines. Instead, he reclined the seat 2 inches, pulled his hat lower, and stayed where he was another hour, watching the aurora weaken and regroup and then blur as thin cloud began to move back across the sky. At some point, the phone lit up with Sarah's name. He watched it ring, then stop. A minute later, a voicemail notification appeared, followed by another. He did not listen. He knew the shapes available to that conversation and had no wish to enter any of them, while the bruise of the pain still sat inside him like a warning label he had chosen not to read. Near 1 in the morning, he drove 10 slow miles to a private campground that advertised winter hookups, but also had a few unpowered overnight slots. The woman in the office wore a fleece vest over plaid pajamas and looked as if she had been half asleep before he knocked. She slid the clipboard toward him and said, "Cabins are full. I only need a parking space. You got heat in that thing?" "Yes." She looked past him through the office window toward the truck. "You traveling alone?" "Yes." "Roads will be slick by morning." She tapped the weather report pinned beside the register. "Supposed to turn around noon." Walter signed the form. When she handed back his card, her eyes lingered on his face a fraction longer than necessary. Not concern exactly. Assessment. He wondered what she saw. Fatigue, probably, and age, and the kind of stiffness that made older men look as if they were always exiting a vehicle, even when standing still. "There's coffee in the lodge from 6, she said. He nodded and appreciated. In the truck, he did not sleep so much as drop in and out of a guarded half-rest. Each time he drifted, a discomfort somewhere called him back. The knee, his neck, the dull live ache under the sternum that had settled but not disappeared. Around 4, he woke to the sound of sleet tapping against the roof and lay still long enough to make sure the chest pain had not returned in force. It had not. What remained was enough to remember, not enough to compel. At 6:30, he walked stiffly to the lodge with the cane and poured coffee from a metal urn into a styrofoam cup. The room contained 2 mismatched sofas, a puzzle in progress on a folding table, and a television showing local morning news to no one. A man in his 60s wearing a Carhartt jacket sat by the window reading a hunting magazine. "Lights last night?" the man asked without looking up. Walter stopped at the sugar caddy, though he took his coffee black. "For a while." "Good show?" Walter thought of the green unfolding over the trees, the phone under his hand, the pain tightening him into a shape he had not chosen. "Yes," he said. "Worth seeing." The man nodded as if that settled a matter and turned a page. Back in the truck, Walter finally opened email. Sarah had sent 3 messages overnight. The subject lines alone were enough. "Call me, then please." Then, just before dawn, "Dad, I'm serious." He did not open them first. Williams's message sat flagged at the top. Walter tapped it. The doctor's tone was more direct than before, stripped now of the softer buffer language physicians used when they still believed persuasion might work gradually. "Walter, cardiology has reviewed the echo. Given the severity of your stenosis and your symptoms, surgical intervention is being strongly recommended on an urgent basis. Without treatment, your short-term prognosis is poor. I do not say this lightly. If you have had chest pain, near syncope, or worsening shortness of breath, you need immediate evaluation. 6 months survival without intervention is significantly worse once symptomatic. Please contact us today. If you are traveling, go to the nearest ER." Walter read the message once through, then again from the line, "Without treatment, your short-term prognosis is poor." It was peculiar how language could become more concrete and less believable at the same time. 6 months. Immediate evaluation. Survival. These were clear words. Cleaner than maybe. Cleaner than concerning. They belonged to the world of decision trees and published outcomes and percentages converted into recommendations. He understood that world. He had trusted versions of it all his life. But there was another fact now, present alongside the email, and not reducible by it. He had been under the Alaska sky the night before, looking up at the lights he had postponed for 50 years. And when his chest had seized hard enough to offer him the hospital route in real time, he had not taken it. That mattered, not nobly, not morally, but it mattered because it had already happened. He closed the email and removed the flag. Then he opened the notebook. Item 1 stared back at him. Drive to Alaska, see the Aurora Borealis. He uncapped the pen and, with steadier handwriting than the night before, drew a line through the entire sentence. The ink cut cleanly across the page. Beside it, smaller, he wrote, "Worth the drive." He looked at the words for a moment longer than necessary, not admiring them, only making sure they were true enough to leave there. Then he closed the notebook, set it on the passenger seat, and started the truck. The trace. Sarah was in the middle of explaining parallel structure to a room full of juniors who did not care when the call came through. Not her father, Dr. Williams' office. She saw the name on her phone face up beside the attendance sheet and kept talking for one more sentence. Something about balance and rhythm, even as a bad pressure moved through her body ahead of thought. The bell hadn't rung yet. Half the class was still pretending to take notes. One boy in the back was tapping his pencil against a water bottle in a way that had been bothering her for 10 minutes. Her phone buzzed again. "All right," she said too quickly. "Take 5, quietly." No one stayed quiet, but she was already walking to the hall. The corridor outside the classroom smelled faintly of floor cleaner and wet jackets. Someone farther down was laughing too loudly. A copier whirred in the workroom near the office. Sarah pressed answer and kept moving until she reached the alcove by the faculty restroom, where the sound of the building thinned just enough to hear. "This is Sarah Hale. Ms. Hale, this is Dr. Andrew Williams." His voice was careful from the first word. That made everything worse. Sarah leaned one shoulder against the cinder block wall. "What happened?" "Nothing acute that I know of," he said. "I'm calling because we've been unable to reach your father consistently, and there are findings I'm concerned about." She closed her eyes briefly. "He won't answer because he doesn't want to." "I understand." "No, I don't think you do." Her voice came out sharper than she intended, then sharpened further. "You called me from your office line during third period, Dr. Williams. That means you're worried enough to go around him, but not worried enough to actually do anything." There was a pause on the line, not offended, measured. "What I can do," he said, "is tell you that your father's recent cardiac evaluation suggests a condition serious enough that I have recommended urgent follow-up and surgical consultation. What I cannot do is force a competent adult patient to accept treatment or to disclose his plans." Sarah pushed away from the wall and started pacing the length of the alcove. "So he can just drive off with a critical diagnosis and everyone shrugs and says autonomy?" "No one is shrugging. That's what it feels like." "I know." The quietness of that answer stopped her for half a second. Students passed at the end of the hall, glancing over with the quick curiosity teenagers reserve for adults having private conversations in public spaces. Sarah turned slightly toward the wall. "Did he tell you where he was going?" she asked. "No. But you know he left?" "Yes." "How bad is it?" Another pause. "I need to be careful here. Please don't do the lawyer version with me." "This isn't the lawyer version." She pressed her fingers hard into the bridge of her nose. On the far side of the door behind her, her students were now fully talking. She could picture the room tipping out of order without her. It felt suddenly obscene that parallel structure and missing homework still existed. "Then give me the real version," she said. Williams exhaled softly. "The real version is that he has severe aortic stenosis. The real version is that symptoms matter. Chest pain matters. Exertional shortness of breath matters. The real version is that I believe he needs evaluation soon, and that I am concerned he is minimizing what is happening." Sarah stared at the opposite wall, where someone had taped up a faded poster about attendance incentives. "Did he say he was refusing surgery?" "He did not say yes. And that's enough for you to hear no." "It's enough for me to be worried," Williams said, "which is why I'm calling you." She wanted to stay angry. Anger was cleaner. But beneath it, something colder had already begun arranging the facts into a shape she did not want. Her father had sold his house. He had stopped answering. His doctor was calling her from behind the firewall of medical caution to say, in essence, he may be in trouble, and he is choosing to stay in trouble. Sarah asked, "If I find him and he says no, that's it? That's the whole system? If he's alert, oriented, and understands the consequences of refusing care, then yes, that is largely the system." She laughed once, without humor. "Fantastic." "I'm sorry," he said, and now he sounded tired rather than guarded. "I know that's not useful." No, but it was more honest than reassurance would have been. The warning bell rang over the intercom, thin and shrill in the hallway. Sarah looked through the narrow, wired glass window in her classroom door and saw 3 students already standing. "Has he had chest pain?" she asked. "I can't answer every specific..." "He did, didn't he?" Williams did not answer directly. "If you hear from him, tell him any worsening symptoms should be evaluated immediately." The careful wording was answer enough. Sarah said, "All right." After she hung up, she stayed where she was for a moment longer than she could afford, her phone still in her hand, the bell noise fading, the corridor filling again. What she felt was not exactly panic. Panic scattered. This was narrower and more efficient. It made her think in columns. Find him. Then what? Then what? She went back into the classroom and finished the period badly. She assigned a worksheet she had not meant to use until Friday, answered a question about semicolons with visible impatience. And when the students filed out, she told the teacher across the hall she needed coverage for the next class and went to the assistant principal's office before she could think too much about whether she was overreacting. By 11:30, she was sitting in her car in the school parking lot with the engine off, calling Leah Chen. Leah answered on the second ring. "Sarah, hi." Her voice carried that same polished steadiness and Sarah remembered from the brief voicemail days earlier. But now there was caution in it too. Leah knew enough to know she had been made part of something family-shaped and unwelcome. "This is awkward," Sarah said. "I know. It's all right." "No, it isn't." Sarah looked through the windshield at the wet March glare on the blacktop. A kid in a varsity jacket cut across the lot carrying a takeout tray from somewhere off campus. "I need to know exactly what my father told you." Leah paused. "I'm not sure I should be discussing a client's private decisions in detail. I'm not asking for staging notes. I'm asking whether he said where he was going, what timeline he gave you, whether he looked sick, whether he was coherent." That made Leah hesitate differently. "He was coherent," she said at last. "Very much so. Organized, decisive. He wanted a fast sale. Minimal delay, cash if possible." "Did he say why?" "No." "Did he seem—" Sarah stopped. Frail sounded insulting. Dying sounded impossible. "Off?" Leah chose her answer with professional care. "He seemed like a man in a hurry who did not want the hurry discussed." Sarah let that sit. In the silence, she could hear papers shifting on Leah's end. Keyboard clicks. The low office hush of people keeping appointments and closing files. Ordinary work. It made Sarah want to throw something. "Did he tell you where he'd be reachable?" "No." "Did he leave a forwarding address?" "Not yet." Sarah pressed her thumb against the steering wheel seam until it hurt. "Do you happen to know what he drove?" "A pickup, older Ford, dark blue, I think." "Not his usual car, of course not." Leah said, more gently now. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I didn't realize when I called you before that he hadn't told you." Sarah looked down at her lap. A red grading pen lay uncapped in the passenger seat cup holder where she had dropped it that morning. "Neither did I." When she got home that afternoon, the house was full of the ordinary life she had spent years building against chaos. 2 mugs in the sink, her husband's running shoes by the door, a grocery list stuck to the fridge with a magnet from Cannon Beach. She stood in the kitchen with her bag still over one shoulder and listened to the silence of a place where no one had yet died, no one had yet disappeared, no one had yet asked her to prove how much she loved them by following them across a continent. Her husband, Mark, came in from the back deck carrying a bag of potting soil he had apparently forgotten in the rain. He took one look at her face and set it down by the door. What happened? She hated that she nearly cried at the question. Instead, she said, My dad's doctor called. He's worse than he told me." Mark was already moving closer. "Worse how?" "Heart, serious, potentially fixable, apparently. Except he's driving around somewhere refusing to be found because he's decided this is all some kind of—" She broke off, angry now, not at Walter, but at language. Adventure was too generous. Episode was too small. Project. Mark stood with both hands on his hips, absorbing. He was a civil engineer, softer in manner than her father, and perhaps for that reason capable of irritating Walter within 6 minutes of any shared meal. He did not rush in with a solution. One of the reasons she had married him. "Can the doctor tell you more?" he asked. "Not enough." "Can the police help?" "For what? Being 75 and insane but technically competent?" Mark gave her a look. "Sarah." "I know." She pulled off her coat and dropped it over a chair. Her pulse still felt too high under the surface, not visible, only present in the way everything around her now seemed slightly underlabeled. The room, the fridge, the rain against the window over the sink. All of it still belonged to the day she had started in, but she no longer did. Mark said, "Okay, then what do you need?" That was the first useful question anyone had asked. She spent the next 3 hours assembling fragments. Credit card login. Recent charges. A gas station in northern British Columbia. A motel hold in Alaska that had already cleared. Another charge at a campground store so small it did not even show a proper merchant name. Only a string of letters and a location pin when she dug far enough. She hated that she knew his old passwords well enough to guess variations. She hated more that he had never changed them. She called the credit card company and got nowhere. She called again and got a different representative and slightly farther nowhere. She listened to 6 voicemails from Walter in a row, most of them old. Birthday acknowledgments, rain checks on dinner, one message from 3 years earlier saying he had left a box of canning jars in her garage by mistake. Then the recent ones. The ones from the road. Brief, maddening, apparently normal. Just checking in. Road's fine. Phone signal is bad. Don't make this larger than it is. That last one had been left at 8:14 p.m., 2 nights earlier. His voice flatter than usual, as if fatigue had worn off whatever surface polish he still had for her. She played it again. Don't make this larger than it is. Not breathless, not slurred, but not right either. There was a thinness to it she could not have explained to anybody who did not know him. A missing pressure, as if the sentence itself had cost him more than he wanted it to. By dinner, she had stopped calling it a trip in her own head. Not because she thought he literally wanted to die. She knew him better than that. Walter did not romanticize death. He did not even romanticize suffering. If anything, he considered both vulgar when discussed too openly. But he was behaving like a man who had accepted a version of his own disappearance and found a way to make it look organized. That was worse. At 7:30, she called a private investigator recommended by another teacher whose sister had used him during a custody fight. The fact that this was now her life did not hit her until the receptionist transferred her and a man named Dennis Cole answered in a voice too unhurried for the subject at hand. Cole Investigations. Sarah turned away from the kitchen where Mark was loading the dishwasher with deliberate quiet. My father is 75. He is traveling alone, medically unstable, and avoiding contact. I need to find him. Cole did not interrupt. She explained in fast, clipped pieces, hearing herself sound like the exact kind of person she disliked. Educated, frantic, expecting the world to produce a specialist for every private disaster. But Cole only asked for the things that mattered. Full name, recent vehicle description, known route, last confirmed location, whether law enforcement had been contacted, whether there was any known cognitive impairment, whether he had cash or only cards. No dementia? Cole asked. No. History of disappearing before? No. Voluntary adult then? The phrase made her teeth hurt. Yes. All right, he said. That limits certain options, but not all. We can do locates, pattern tracking, database pulls, maybe some field work if we get a usable corridor. When can you start? Tonight if you sign the agreement tonight. She signed within 7 minutes. Mark found her afterwards sitting at the dining table, staring at a map on her laptop. Every recent gas charge transformed into a point on a route she had never wanted to imagine. He set a plate beside her. You need to eat. I'm not hungry. Doesn't matter. She took 2 bites because he was right and because refusing food felt dangerously like inheritance. At 9:15, Dr. Williams called back. This time she was calmer, which only made her voice more dangerous. I'm trying to locate him, she said before he could speak. I need you to tell me whether this is me being appropriately alarmed or me stepping into a situation that's still basically hypothetical. Williams was quiet a beat, then, I would not call this hypothetical. She stood and walked into the living room, away from Mark, away from the map. Rain tapped faintly against the front windows. That's still not the same as saying he could die. I'm saying the situation carries real risk. Why are all of you allergic to plain nouns? Because plain nouns sound absolute when medicine often isn't. She nearly snapped back, then stopped. He sounded tired in a way that made her picture him at a desk under fluorescent office light, tie loosened, trying not to become the villain in a family story because he had to speak in percentages. More quietly, she said, if he were your father, would you go after him? Williams did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had changed a little. Yes, he said. That was enough. The first report from the PI arrived just after midnight. Not a miracle. Not GPS magic. A compilation mostly. Credit card trace consistent with route south out of Alaska. Fuel purchase in the Yukon. Motel outside Whitehorse. Vehicle match probable from a grainy parking lot camera at a truck stop. A desk clerk at one roadside lodge who remembered an older American guy with a cane and a blue Ford asking for ground floor access and extra ice. Sarah sat at the kitchen island in her sweatshirt with her hair still damp from a shower she barely remembered taking, reading each line twice. Older American guy with a cane. Extra ice. She did not know why that detail undid her more than the rest. Ice meant pain, swelling, something specific enough to be managed. Mark came in half awake from upstairs, saw her expression, and put both hands flat on the counter. What? She turned the laptop toward him. He read in silence, jaw tightening. He's not okay, she said. Mark nodded once. The next report came at 5:48 a.m., when the house was still dark and Sarah had not truly slept. She had dozed on the couch with a blanket over her legs and her phone in her hand, waking every 40 minutes, convinced she had missed something irreversible. This one was shorter. Probable southbound movement through Montana. Truck sighting outside a roadside diner off I-15 corridor yesterday late afternoon. Witness described older male driver appearing fatigued, moving slowly. Possible medical issue. License partially matched vehicle description. More to follow. Sarah read it standing in the blue dark of the living room. Montana. Not dead, not home, still moving. She opened the map attachment. A red dot marked the most recent probable location, then pulsed once as the screen adjusted. It was not live tracking. She knew that. A delayed point only. But the image still reached her body before it reached reason. So this was where he had shrunk to now. A dot on a map, one old man in one truck somewhere, under a huge sky, driving south with a failing heart and enough stubbornness to make every mile feel chosen. Mark found her there 10 minutes later, fully dressed now, shoes on. "You're leaving," he said. It was not a question. She nodded. "What do you need me to do?" There were practical answers. School leave forms. Call her department head. Text their son at college before he heard a mangled version later. Feed the dog. Keep the house moving. All the ordinary supports of a life that assumed crises would be local and solvable. But what she needed most was permission she didn't have to ask for. "I need you not to tell me I'm overreacting." Mark crossed the room and kissed her forehead once. I was not going to make that mistake. By 7:30, she had emailed her principal requesting emergency leave, thrown clothes into a duffel bag without folding them, packed a charger, water bottles, ibuprofen, a printed map in case her phone failed somewhere rural, and the spare blanket from the hall closet because Walter would never think to carry one good enough. The absurd tenderness of that last thought made her have to stop in the doorway of the laundry room and breathe before continuing. As she zipped the bag, another text came in from Dennis Cole. Most recent confirmed card activity posted overnight. Gas purchase near Butte, Montana. Timestamp attached. Sending location pin. A second message followed with the map. Sarah stared at the small, bright point on the screen. Not because it solved anything. By now, he was certainly elsewhere. 50 miles, 100, more. But the dot gave shape to motion. It told her the search had crossed from abstract fear into geography. She picked up her keys. Outside, morning rain hung over the street in a fine silver mist. The neighborhood looked painfully normal. Recycling bins at the curb, a jogger in a reflective vest, someone warming up a Subaru across the way. Sarah stood beside her car for one last second before getting in. On the phone screen, the Montana pin glowed against the map like a weak signal still managing, somehow, to transmit. The passenger seat. "Dad, are you trying to die in this truck?" Rain struck the windshield in hard, slanting bursts that made the rest stop beyond it look temporary and badly drawn. The lot was half full of semis and mud-striped pickups, all of them filmed with the same cold gray wash. Sarah stood in front of Walter's hood with her hair wet against her cheeks and one hand braced on the truck as if she had stopped it by force. She looked smaller than she had on the phone and more dangerous. Walter kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on the black notebook lying closed on the seat beside him. He had known, once she started driving, that this was possible. Not likely, but possible. Sarah had always been more stubborn in motion than in argument. He pressed the button and unlocked the passenger door. The locks clicked. Sarah stared at him another second through the rain-streaked glass. "That's not an answer." "No," Walter said, though he doubted she heard him. She yanked the door open and climbed in, slamming it hard enough to shake the dashboard. Cold air came with her, along with wet wool, rainwater, and the outside smell of diesel and gravel. She sat breathing hard, one hand still on the door as if she had not yet decided whether she was entering or arresting him. Walter turned off the wipers. The sudden stillness made the rain louder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Up close, Sarah looked exhausted. The skin under her eyes had darkened. Her ponytail was loose and collapsing. She was wearing the same practical navy rain jacket she wore on school field trips and grocery runs and every other errand in a life organized around schedules. He noticed, absurdly, that there was a coffee stain near the cuff. "You ended my calls and..." she said. "Yes, I drove 11 hours today." Walter nodded once. "That's all you've got?" "I didn't ask you to." That landed exactly as badly as it deserved. Sarah turned toward him fully then, anger returning to her face with enough force to sharpen it. "No, you didn't. That's been the theme for about 40 years. He looked out through the windshield. A truck farther down the lot reversed into a space with the long electronic beeping of heavy machinery. A woman in a red poncho hurried from the rest stop building to an SUV holding a paper cup over her head. Sarah laughed once, short and ugly. "You sell your house, disappear with a serious cardiac diagnosis, ignore your doctor, ignore me, and when I finally find you in a truck stop in Montana, your position is still what? That I'm being dramatic?" Walter said nothing, because part of that was true and part of it was not. And the trouble with Sarah had always been that she had inherited enough of him to make accuracy feel accusatory. She leaned back hard against the seat and closed her eyes for a second. The movement looked less like composure than depletion. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped. "Did you have chest pain?" He turned toward her. Her eyes were open now, fixed on him, not furious in the same way as before. Worse than furious. Exact. "Did you?" she asked. Walter looked back through the windshield. Rainwater crept in narrow lines down the glass. The defroster hummed low. The truck smelled faintly of old coffee and the menthol cream he had rubbed into his knee that morning. Yes, he said. Sarah's face changed, not dramatically, just a small withdrawal, as if something inside her had stepped back and hit a wall. When? In Alaska. Her hand went to her mouth, then dropped again. And you didn't call anyone? No. Jesus Christ. She turned away from him and looked out her own window, though there was nothing to see there but wet asphalt and the blurred side of the rest stop building. He waited. He had learned long ago that Sarah's silences came in types. This one was not empty. It was active. A silence in which she was trying to keep herself from saying the first thing that arrived. When she finally spoke, she did not look at him. Did you think I wouldn't notice? She asked. Did you think I'd just… what? Let you drive off and maybe hear about it from some sheriff's office in Idaho? I wasn't in Idaho. She turned back so fast he nearly flinched, not at the motion but at the look in her face. You cannot still be doing that. You cannot still be correcting the wrong part. He let that go. The black notebook remained between them, closer to his leg than to hers. Walter rested his fingertips on the cover for a second. Then he picked it up and held it out. Sarah frowned at it. What is that? You came all this way, he said. You might as well look. She took the notebook without thanks. Her fingers were cold and damp from the rain. She opened it with the hesitation people reserve for private documents and medical bills, things likely to alter a room. The truck grew quiet around the turning pages. Walter watched her face more than the notebook itself. First suspicion, then confusion, then something tighter, as she understood what she was looking at. The list was written across 2 pages now, items added in the margins, dates noted beside a few of them in the clipped practical style he had used for decades on engineering sketches, repair notes, tax folders. Some had been crossed out. 1. Drive to Alaska. See the aurora borealis. 2. Eat breakfast at Dell's Diner and talk. 3. Go to Chena Hot Springs. 4. Drive the Alaska Highway myself. 5. Glacier again. 6. Return Ed's tool chest to Brian Harper. 7. Sell the house clean. 8. Sort garage notes for Sarah. 9. Mail Ellen's letters to Ruth. 10. See the Pacific from Highway 101 one more time. 11. Finish watch repair. 12. Tell Sarah I love her. Sarah read to the bottom and stopped. The rain kept hitting the truck roof in irregular bursts. Somewhere nearby, a diesel engine caught and settled into a low, steady idle. She went back and read the page again, slower. Walter could see the moment item 12 reached her properly. Not because she looked surprised, because she didn't. Her mouth tightened the way it did when she recognized something she had always known and still wished not to know. He said, it's not a suicide note. She kept her eyes on the notebook. That's your defense? It's a list. Yeah. She turned 1 page farther as if there might be another version after this one. Some key to the whole thing in smaller print. There wasn't. I can see that. Her thumb rested near the bottom line. Tell Sarah I love her. That one, she said. Did you plan to get around to it eventually, or was this just your reminder system? Walter looked at his hands on the wheel. The question landed harder than the shouting had. Because it was unfair. Because it was fair. Because writing it down had seemed at the time like a practical correction, and hearing it spoken back to him made it sound like what it was, evidence. I wrote it so I wouldn't leave it undone, he said. Sarah gave a short laugh that broke in the middle. You hear how that sounds, right? He did. He did not answer. She shut the notebook but did not hand it back. Instead, she kept it in her lap with both hands on it, as if it might open again on its own. So this is what I am now, she said. Item 12. That's not what it means. Then tell me what it means. Walter looked at her. Really looked. Rain-dark hair, tired skin, anger propping up something much closer to fear. She was 49 years old and still, in certain lights, still also, the 14-year-old who had stood in the kitchen doorway after her mother's funeral not crying because she had decided somebody in the house had to remain useful. It means, he said slowly, that there were things I intended to finish. That is not better. No, he said, probably not. Sarah stared at him as if she had not expected agreement. Her anger shifted again, not disappearing but changing temperature. You had options, she said, but that's the part I cannot get past. You still have options. Walter's knee ached from the drive. The old pressure in his chest was absent for the moment, but not absent enough to forget. His body had become a collection of unreliable reports. He was tired clear through to the bone. I have surgery, he said. Maybe surgery, then evaluations, recovery, follow-ups, more appointments, restrictions, months of being watched. He kept his voice level because levelness was all that kept it from becoming defense. And then what? Sarah blinked at him. And then maybe you live. Like what? She opened her hands in disbelief. Like a person, like my father, like somebody who gets more time. Walter looked out at the lot again. A teenage boy in a gray hoodie was pumping gas into a Subaru while his girlfriend sat inside eating from a paper sack. Two truckers were standing under the awning by the vending machines, talking with coffee cups in their hands. Ordinary people in weather. No tragedy music, no moral framework. Just choices, all of them smaller than this one. I don't want to die on an operating table, he said. Sarah's answer came back at once. I don't want you to die in a truck stop. The words sat there between them. Walter rubbed one hand once over his mouth. I don't want, he said, and then stopped because the next part sounded weak in his own head even before speaking it. Not weak as in emotional, weak as in imprecise. He tried again. I don't want whatever years are left to turn into procedures and rehab schedules and people explaining my own limits to me. Sarah shook her head. You keep saying it like that, like the only choices are perfect freedom or humiliating decline. That is not what I said. It is exactly what you said. No, he turned toward her fully now. What I said is, I do not want to spend whatever time remains being turned into a case. Sarah held his gaze. 10 more years with me wasn't enough? The line did not come out polished. It came out too fast, too raw, and then was done. Hanging in the warm, cramped cab with the rain and the hum of the defroster and the smell of wet fabric. Walter did not answer immediately. He could have disputed the number, could have said there was no promise of 10 years, that medicine did not guarantee anything, that she was making a hypothetical sentimental because it served her. All of that would have been partly true, and none of it was what the question meant. Sarah looked away first, furious now at herself as much as at him. Forget it. I wasn't saying you weren't enough. She laughed again, more quietly. Then what were you saying? Walter stared at the steering wheel. The leather had worn smooth where his thumbs usually rested. I was saying I know how these things go. No, Sarah said. You know one version of how these things go, the one where you're in control because you have already decided the ending. That's not control. What would you call it? He thought of the hospital corridors he had walked with Ed, the waiting rooms, the discreet pamphlets, the good chairs designed to make people grateful for furniture, while they waited to hear how much of a body could be repaired. He thought of Ellen, not from the end of her life, but from the middle of it, when illness had not yet entered the house, and he had still believed enough planning could prevent disorder from becoming permanent. He thought of the night in Alaska, with the phone beside his hand, and the pain pressing hard enough to split the world into possible next steps. I'd call it choosing the terms I can still choose, he said. Sarah looked at him for several seconds without speaking. Then she said, You think this only belongs to you? Walter frowned slightly. It does. No. Her voice stayed low now, which made it more dangerous than if she had shouted. Your body does. Your choice does. Fine. But the consequence doesn't stop at your skin. He said nothing. You get to refuse surgery, she went on. You get to disappear. You get to call it dignity if that makes it easier to hear yourself. But you do not get to act surprised that it lands somewhere. It lands on me. Rain slid down the passenger window in quick, clean streams. Sarah's face in the reflection looked older than he ever permitted himself to notice. Not old, just fully adult in a way that made his own absence from parts of her life harder to reduce to temperament. I know it affects you, he said. No, you know that in theory. She tapped the notebook once with 2 fingers. This is theory. This is organized theory. He almost said that isn't fair, but fairness had very little to do with any of it. Instead, he said, What do you want from me right now? Sarah was quiet. Then, unexpectedly tired, she said, I wanted to drag you home, actually. That was the plan. Find you, scream at you, maybe call an ambulance over your objections if you looked bad enough and let strangers argue the rest. She stared down at the notebook. But now I don't know. Walter looked at her profile. The wet hair at her temple had begun to dry in a loose bend. She was still holding the notebook as if it were both accusation and proof of life. Finally, he said, There's a diner 2 exits down. I was going to stop there. Sarah gave him a disbelieving look. That's your transition? I haven't eaten since 7. She leaned back against the seat and shut her eyes. For a moment, he thought she might tell him to go to hell, which would at least have the virtue of clarity. Instead, she said, Fine. He waited. Then, without opening her eyes, she added, I'm not leaving. Walter started the truck. The diner sat just off the highway beside a gas station and a motel with a vacancy sign missing the A. The rain had weakened to a fine, cold mist by then. Mud clung to the wheel wells. Walter parked badly on the first attempt and corrected, aware of Sarah watching the motion without comment. Inside, the place smelled of fryer oil, coffee, damp coats, and something sweet baking behind the counter. 4 booths were occupied. A television in the corner showed muted local news with captions no one was reading. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with silver hair braided down her back, looked up from refilling sugar caddies and gave them the quick sizing glance service workers perfected over years. 2, she asked. Sarah answered first, yes. They took a booth near the window. Walter slid in more slowly than he once would have, managing the knee without making a show of it. Sarah sat across from him, notebook now tucked into her bag but not returned. Menus lay between them like a courtesy. The waitress came back with water and 2 coffees, though neither of them had asked yet. Long drive? She asked. Walter said, something like that. Sarah looked as if she might say something sharper, then didn't. When the waitress left, silence returned, but it was not the silence from the truck. There were sounds around it now. Silverware, the coffee machine hissing, somebody laughing at the counter, boots squeaking faintly on damp tile. Sarah wrapped both hands around the coffee mug without drinking. What happens now? Walter opened the menu and closed it again. I keep driving. To where? South. That is not a location. It's the direction. Sarah gave him a look over the rim of her cup. You are exhausting. Walter almost said, you came after me. Instead, he reached for the sugar jar and pushed it absent-mindedly to the side. I'm going to Glacier, he said. Then Washington, a few more stops. And I'm supposed to just ride along while you do your farewell tour? He disliked the phrase on sight. That isn't what this is. Then what is it? He looked at the laminated menu. Chicken fried steak, patty melt, soup of the day. The ordinary durability of American diners had always appealed to him. Nothing about them pretended to be cured of use. It's a trip, he said, knowing even as he said it that the word had outlived usefulness. Sarah let out a breath through her nose. You really can't stop saying it. The waitress returned and asked if they were ready. Walter ordered meatloaf. Sarah asked for eggs and toast, though it was nearly 3 in the afternoon. The waitress wrote it down without surprise. Then, glancing between them with the casual boldness of people who had worked long enough to treat strangers as temporary weather, she asked, You 2 married or father-daughter? Sarah answered immediately. He's my dad. Something in her voice made Walter look up. Not because she sounded sentimental. She didn't. She sounded certain. Irritated, tired, angry, unsoftened, and certain. As if whatever else he was currently doing to her, she still refused to let the category blur. The waitress nodded. Thought so, she said, and went off toward the kitchen. Walter kept his eyes on Sarah a second longer. She looked back at him, wary now, as if expecting another evasion or correction. But he had none ready. Only the odd sensation that it had been longer than he realized since he'd heard her identify him that directly, without qualification, in a voice that did not ask permission from either of them. Outside the window, rain thinned to mist over the parking lot. Inside, the coffee between them gave off a low, steady heat. What remains? The drive west out of Montana turned quieter than either of them had planned for, and harder than silence usually was. Sarah took the first shift after the diner because Walter's face had gone a shade flatter than normal halfway through the meal, and because he did not argue very well once he was tired. She drove his truck with the seat too far back and the mirrors wrong, her shoulders set in a line that made clear she was not enjoying the concession. Walter sat beside her with the black notebook in the pocket of his jacket and watched rain dry into streaks across the side window as the weather gave up and the sky lifted by degrees. There was no dramatic reconciliation after the diner. No speech, no agreement. They had simply walked back to the truck, gotten in, and continued south. Sarah drove as if the road had personally inconvenienced her. Competently. Slightly too fast. One hand at the top of the wheel, the other near the console. She had stopped asking where exactly they were going and begun asking things like whether he needed water, whether the seat angle was making his knee worse, whether he had taken any more ibuprofen than the bottle allowed. Practical questions, delivered with a tone that turned care into temporary management. Walter answered them without thanking her. Gratitude would have made it more tender than either of them could handle yet. By late afternoon, the road widened, flattened, and grew more familiar. The landscape lost some of its northern severity and became again the long American in-between of service stations, truck plazas, chain hotels, and fields still winter brown under low light. Sarah pulled off near Missoula for gas. While she was inside paying, Walter stayed in the passenger seat and opened the notebook again. The list looked different now that someone else had seen it. Less private, slightly theatrical, though he knew it had not felt that way while writing it. He turned past the first page and found the additional notes he had made on the road. Gas mileage, motel names, one restaurant recommendation from a waitress in the Yukon. the location of a hardware store near Talk, where he had bought a flashlight that turned out to be useless. On a later page, tucked between those things, were the smaller items Sarah had only skimmed before. Fix Ellen's wall clock. Eat the mushroom burger at Halpern's after one last game. Find the Oregon Beach photo. He stared at the middle one for a moment. Halpern's was not even a good restaurant. It sat 2 blocks from the old high school football stadium in Bellevue and had survived on habit longer than quality. But on Friday nights during Sarah's sophomore and junior years, after home games she marched in with the band for, Walter had taken her there with 3 or 4 other parents, all of them damp from bleachers and cold air. She used to order a burger with no onions and extra pickles and peel the top bun off first because she said the diner toasted it too hard. At the time, he had thought of those nights as logistics. Pick her up, feed her. Get home before midnight. Keep the car gassed and the insurance paid and the furnace running and her mother from worrying about the weather. He had not understood until much later that memory did not sort by intention. It sorted by nearness. Sarah came back out carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag of pretzels. She opened the driver's door, saw the notebook in his lap, and paused just slightly before climbing in. "What now?" she said, not looking directly at the page. "Item 8? Walter closed the notebook without hurry. "Coffee?" She handed one over. It was too hot. He held it by the lid seam until it cooled enough to drink. As they pulled back onto the highway, Sarah said almost casually, "That burger place on the list, Halpern's, is that the place by Roosevelt Field?" Walter turned his head a fraction. "Yes. Used to make me go there when I still had clarinet reeds in my pocket. You liked the fries. I liked being hungry." He almost smiled. It passed too quickly to count. "Same thing at 16. Sarah drove another mile before saying, "I didn't know you remembered that." Walter looked at the road ahead. It was on the list. "That's not what I meant." He knew. He let the statement go by like a sign he had already missed the turn for. They reached Washington the following day under a sky the color of old aluminum. Not Seattle yet. Not the east side, but close enough that the road signs began naming exits Walter knew in his bones. Places he had driven to for work, errands, hospital visits, soccer games, parent-teacher conferences, funerals. Sarah had become quieter as they neared home territory, as if proximity itself complicated her anger. Near Ellensburg, she said, "You can't go straight back to your place." Walter glanced over. "Why not?" "Because it's half sold." "It is not half sold. You know what I mean." He did. Leah had already lined up showings and a probable buyer who liked fast closes and disliked emotional complications. The house was no longer a house in the ordinary sense. It had entered the paperwork phase where rooms stopped being rooms and became square footage again. Sarah kept her eyes on the road. "You're coming to my place for a night. Maybe 2. Walter did not answer. "That wasn't a suggestion." "It sounds like one." She gave him a look. "You can call an Uber from my driveway and resume your principal decline later." That was close enough to funny that he let it stand. By the time they pulled into Sarah's neighborhood, evening had fallen. The houses there were newer than his own by a generation, close but not cramped, each front yard arranged into a studied version of ease. Porch lights glowed warm behind rain-speckled shrubs. A basketball hoop stood over a garage on the corner. Somewhere nearby, a lawn sprinkler ticked on and off in measured arcs, though it was March and the ground hardly needed help. Sarah killed the engine and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. "Mark's inside," she said, "and Eli's home from college for a few days." Walter nodded once. He knows enough not to say anything stupid. That's ambitious for a 19-year-old boy. She looked at him then, tired but not humorless. He's 20. Still ambitious. Inside, the house was warm in the layered, lived-in way his had stopped being years ago. Shoes by the door, 2 backpacks, a dish towel thrown over the oven handle. The smell of roasted chicken lingering from dinner, along with detergent and coffee and the faint damp of jackets drying somewhere out of sight. Mark came from the kitchen wiping his hands on a towel. He was thinner than Walter remembered, or perhaps simply older in a softer way. The face settling, the hair receding without much resistance from him. They had never disliked each other exactly. Their tension came from recognizing in each other competing versions of competence. "Walter," Mark said. "Mark." No handshake. Just enough eye contact to confirm the situation was not simple and did not need pretending. Eli appeared behind his father, tall and unfinished looking in the way young men were, his body still seeming surprised by its own dimensions. Walter had seen him last at Thanksgiving, half grown then too, but something in his face had sharpened since. Sarah's mouth, Mark's patience around the eyes. "Hey, Grandpa," Eli said. Walter felt briefly the odd tilt of time that came from being greeted by one's official title instead of one's name. Hey, no one made a production of his arrival. Sarah showed him the downstairs guest room, which had once been an office and now contained a bed, a bookshelf, and a folded treadmill under a sheet. She put clean towels on the dresser. Bathroom's across the hall, she said. There's Tylenol in the cabinet. Don't take more ibuprofen. He set his bag on the chair. You're becoming oppressive. She shrugged without smiling. Get in line. Later, after he had washed up and changed his shirt, he came into the kitchen to find Eli standing on a chair with the battery cover off the hallway smoke detector, while Mark held the flashlight beneath it. It keeps chirping, Eli said. I changed the battery last month. Walter set his coffee cup down. Did you check the manufacture date? Eli looked over. What? On the back, smoke detectors age out. Mark handed Walter the flashlight without comment, as if the role transfer were obvious. Walter took the detector down, turned it over, and read the stamp. 10 years, he said. This one's 12. Eli, still on the chair, frowned down at the plastic casing. That seems like a scam. It's chemistry, Walter said. Mark gave a short sound that might have been agreement. Walter showed Eli how to reset the bracket, how to check the hardwired connection, how not to over-tighten the screws. The whole thing took 8 minutes. Nobody thanked him in an elaborate way. Eli just said, got it, and carried the old detector to the garage. Sarah stood at the sink rinsing plates from dinner and had gone very still by the time Walter turned back. What? He said. Nothing. It was not nothing. He could tell by the set of her shoulders. But he also knew enough not to press. She was watching him do exactly the kind of small, competent thing that had always made up most of his love. And that now, under the circumstances, probably looked to her less like proof and more like evidence of waste. The next morning, he watered the potted herbs on the back patio because they were dry, and because Sarah had left for work early to clear her afternoon for the cardiology appointment. Williams had somehow managed to arrange. Basil, rosemary, a stubborn thyme plant going woody at the base. The hose nozzle leaked at the handle. He took it apart on the patio table, found the cracked washer, and replaced it with one from the small plastic organizer in Mark's garage, which was badly sorted. When Sarah came back from school at noon, he was kneeling on one pad of the folded patio cushion, reassembling the sprayer head. She stood in the sliding door with her bag still over her shoulder. You don't have to fix things. It was leaking. That's not the point. Walter tightened the collar and tested the spray into the lawn. The fan pattern held. Seems adjacent to the point. Sarah looked at him for a second longer. Her face had that tired, pinched stillness it got when she was choosing not to escalate. The cardiology office was in a medical building in Bellevue, not far from the clinic, where Williams had first said the word stenosis. Clean glass, neutral carpeting, the sort of place designed to keep panic from gathering visible shape. Sarah drove. Walter sat in the passenger seat and watched familiar intersections slide by with the strange double vision of someone both returned and already partly gone. In the waiting room, a television ran a home improvement show with the captions on. A woman in an oversized cardigan filled out insurance forms using a pen chained to the clipboard. Somewhere behind the frosted doors, a printer kept producing sheets in steady mechanical intervals. Sarah sat beside Walter with her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had lightened. You don't have to come in, he said. Yes, I do. No, you don't. She turned her head toward him. You are not doing this privately anymore. He let that stand because it was, in practice, already true. The cardiologist was younger than Walter expected, late 40s perhaps, precise in manner without seeming rushed. Williams joined by speakerphone for part of the consultation, his voice slightly flattened by the system, but otherwise the same. Factual, patient, more invested than Walter wanted him to be. The explanation was thorough. Valve replacement, risks, likely course with and without intervention, pre-op evaluation, recovery time, expected symptom progression if untreated. A neat architecture of choices built atop a failing piece of tissue. Sarah asked good questions. Complication rate, functional outcomes, recovery burden. Whether travel since diagnosis had worsened anything measurable. Whether surgery now still made sense. Her teacher voice entered and exited without fully taking over. She was not calm exactly, but she was organized, which in her case was close kin to panic. Walter listened. He did not interrupt much. He had heard versions of all this already in fragments, but here it arrived fully assembled, no longer easy to reduce to physician caution or risk-averse culture. Finally, the cardiologist said, Mr. Mercer, medically speaking, I would recommend intervention, clearly. Williams's voice on speaker added, so would I. Sarah did not look at Walter then. She kept her eyes on the edge of the doctor's desk, as if looking directly at him might apply too much pressure and somehow invalidate the moment. Walter folded his hands once in his lap. The room was too warm. The paper on the exam table behind him crinkled every time he shifted his weight. Outside the narrow window, a helicopter crossed the pale sky above the hospital complex and disappeared. "I understand the recommendation," he said. The cardiologist nodded. "Do you have questions about the procedure?" "No." Sarah finally turned toward him. Not pleading yet, just waiting. Walter could feel the shape of their hope in the room, not optimism. More primitive than that. The hope that now that the experts had spoken in the correct sequence, he might align himself with the obvious next step and let everyone resume being frightened in the conventional way. He said, "I'm declining surgery." Silence followed. Not total. The building still hummed faintly around them. Someone rolled equipment down the hallway. But inside the room, the sentence landed cleanly enough to reorganize everything. The cardiologist did not argue at once. He only asked, "Do you understand the likely consequences of that choice?" "Yes." "Can you tell me in your own words what you understand those consequences to be?" Walter almost smiled at the formality of it. Capacity assessment. Documentation. The system checking its own ethics before letting a man walk away. "It means I'm symptomatic," he said. "It means without intervention, my short-term odds are poor. It means chest pain, syncope, worse function, and a decent chance I do not get much more time." Across from him, Sarah had gone perfectly still. Williams's voice came through the speaker softer than before. "Walter, I need to ask one more time whether this is fear talking." Walter looked at the speakerphone, a small black disc in the center of the desk. "Of course it's fear talking," he said. "Fear talks in most decisions worth making. The point is, I still know what I'm saying." No one answered immediately. At last, the cardiologist said, "Then I have to respect your decision. I would strongly advise palliative support and clear return precautions." Sarah made a small sound then. Not a cry, not a protest, more the involuntary release of air when the body understands before the mind has finished. She pressed her lips together hard. Walter signed the refusal forms. That, more than the medical language, changed the atmosphere. Pen to paper. Name on the line. Date, initials. A decision transformed into an object the chart could hold. In the parking garage afterwards, Sarah walked 3 steps ahead of him and did not speak until they reached the truck. Then she stopped with one hand on the passenger door and said, "So, that's it." Walter stood opposite her across the hood. "It appears to be." She nodded once. Her face was pale with effort, but the anger he expected did not come. Something else had replaced it. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, just the exhaustion that followed the end of a struggle when the opponent had not been defeated, only confirmed. "I kept thinking," she said, looking not at him, but at the concrete floor between them, "that if I could just get you in front of the right person or back in the right room or say the right combination of words, somebody would stop this." Walter had no answer that did not sound either self-justifying or cruel. Sarah lifted her eyes then. "And the worst part is, I still don't think you're wrong about all of it." That surprised him enough that he said nothing. She opened the passenger door for him. "Get in, I'm driving." He obeyed. That evening back at her house, the ordinary life of the place resumed around the hole the appointment had punched in the day. Mark grilled salmon. Eli argued with a friend over speakerphone about summer internships. A neighbor's dog barked twice and was silenced. Somebody upstairs took a shower. The dishwasher ran. Walter sat at the dining table and watched Sarah move through the kitchen with a steadiness that cost her something visible. She set plates out, asked Eli to get forks, told Mark the asparagus needed another minute. She did not perform cheerfulness and did not collapse either. She was, Walter thought, behaving the way she had at 14 after Ellen died. Useful first, feelings later, if at all. During dinner, Eli asked him about Alaska. "Did you actually see the lights?" he said. Walter cut a piece of salmon smaller than necessary. "Yes." "Were they like the pictures?" "No." "Better?" Walter considered that. "Stranger." Eli grinned. That sounds better." Sarah kept eating without looking up. After dinner, Walter repaired the clasp on one of Mark's patio storage boxes because it had been catching for months. Then he stood in the hall outside the guest room, listening to the house settle and the sprinkler system outside begin its timed rotation, a low hiss, then the rhythmic tick-tick-tick as the spray head shifted. He did not feel noble. He did not feel relieved. Mostly he felt old and slightly frayed, as if the trip and the confrontation and the appointment had worn through whatever private coding had allowed him to keep his choices neat inside himself. Near midnight, he took the notebook and went out to the back patio. The air was cool, but not cold. Damp earth, clipped grass, the faint mineral smell of water from the sprinklers. Sarah's small herb pots sat in a row along the fence, newly watered and dark at the soil line. The neighborhood was quiet in the intermittent suburban way. Far-off tires on wet pavement, a garage door somewhere. Then nothing again. Walter sat in the patio chair nearest the lawn and set the notebook on his thighs. He did not open it. The sprinkler had turned, paused, and turned again with that same small mechanical click. He listened to it longer than he meant to. There was comfort in timed systems, even badly calibrated ones. Water out, pause, shift, repeat. At the sliding door behind him, the glass reflected the kitchen faintly. For a moment, he saw only the room's dim interior, the outline of chairs, the light left on above the stove. Then another shape appeared in the reflection. Sarah, standing barefoot just inside the door, one hand resting against the frame. She was not interrupting, not calling to him. Only there, watching, or perhaps simply making sure he was still where she had left him. Walter kept his hands on the closed notebook. Neither of them moved. The sprinkler kept time in the dark. The last item. The next 8 months did not pass like borrowed time. They passed like ordinary time, made sharper by being counted. Walter did not move fully into Sarah's house, and he did not fully leave it either. He kept a small furnished rental in Bellevue after the sale of his home closed, a place with beige walls, a short lease, and no history in it. But he spent more nights than he admitted at Sarah's. Some because the drive tired him more now. Some because rain made the dark roads look longer than they were. Some because Eli had a question about replacing a bike chain, or Mark wanted a second set of hands for a fence panel, or Sarah said, without saying please, "You should stay, it's late." Walter never answered those invitations as invitations. He treated them like logistics. All right, fine. Safer not to drive in this. As if weather, not affection, had made the choice. His body narrowed around him over those months, but not all at once and not in a straight line. There were good mornings when he woke with clear lungs and steady legs and enough force in him to forget, for an hour or two, the exact mechanics of what was waiting. There were worse days when the walk from Sarah's driveway to the front door required a pause disguised as looking at the roses. The knee improved, then flared again. The chest pain came only twice in full force after Montana, each time brief, each time teaching him something he had already elected not to learn. He completed 9 items on the list. Not by triumph, not by speed, simply by continuing. He returned Ed Harper's tool chest to Ed's son in Spokane and stayed exactly 23 minutes, because grief between men like that curdled if handled too directly. He stood in Brian Harper's garage while Brian said, "Dad would have liked knowing you kept it dry," and Walter said, "It's a tool chest," which was inadequate and understood as adequate anyway. He drove Highway 101 and stopped at a turnout on the Oregon coast, where the wind came in sideways off the water, and the Pacific looked less beautiful than stubborn. The photograph he had gone looking for, a faded print of Ellen holding Sarah at age 6 in a red sweatshirt on that same beach, turned up later in an old envelope inside a mislabeled file box Mark had stored for him in the garage. Sarah found it first and left it on the kitchen counter under the sugar bowl without comment. He repaired Ellen's wall clock in Sarah's dining room while Eli watched for 10 minutes and then lost interest. The brass pendulum had been sticking for years. Walter took the casing apart on newspaper, cleaned the pivot points, adjusted the suspension spring, and got the thing ticking again just before dinner. Sarah looked up from the stove when it started. "I'd forgotten that sound," she said. Walter did not answer. He was still listening to whether it would hold. It held. He did not become easier to live with because he was dying. That would have been the sentimental version, and Walter had never trusted sentiment that made people simpler than they were. He still corrected thermostat settings, still folded newspapers into neat quarters after reading them, still treated Mark's tool storage system with open contempt, still answered certain questions from Sarah with infuriating brevity. If anything, proximity made some of his old habits worse because there was no longer enough distance for them to blur into character. But Sarah changed how she fought him. Not quickly, not gracefully, and not all the time. In the beginning of those months, she still tried to catch him in opportunities. She brought up William's number while handing him coffee. She left an article on minimally invasive valve replacement on the kitchen island with the sports section. She mentioned, too casually, the husband of a colleague who had gone through surgery at 72 and was now back to hiking. Walter responded by ignoring the article, drinking the coffee, and saying of the hiker, "Good for him." It took her longer than she would have liked to understand that continuing the campaign only made them both smaller. Once she did, she stopped asking the system to overrule him and began, against her own instinct, to watch instead. Watching turned out to be harder, because Walter was not dramatic. If he had lain groaning in bed, or refused food, or said plainly frightened things in the night, she would have known where to put her anger. Instead, he moved through much of life exactly as himself, only more carefully. He showed Eli how to reset the garage door sensors. He replaced the cracked handle on a rake without being asked. He sat through a wet October soccer game for Eli's little cousin and left at halftime only when the chest pressure made standing up more deliberate than usual. He still made terrible coffee when he used Sarah's machine because he refused to believe the grounds had changed and insisted she had become too delicate. Too much water, she told him. It's coffee, not asphalt. It tastes like regret. Then don't drink it. The exchange would end there, not because either of them had won, but because they both heard, underneath it, the steadier truth. He was still there to argue with. Now and then, Sarah thought he was about to say the thing, not in grand scenes, in small openings that presented themselves almost embarrassingly. Once when he handed her the keys after taking her car for emissions testing because she had forgotten, and the registration deadline was the next day. Once when he stood in the doorway of her kitchen after she'd come home from school looking wrecked, and he had, without commentary, already put soup on the stove. Once when she found him in the backyard teaching Eli how to winterize the hose bib, and he looked up with a brief, unguarded softness that vanished before she could trust it. Each time the opening closed in a practical sentence. Your front tires are low. You should eat before grading. This shutoff valve's going bad. He never became the father from someone else's ending. No late-blooming orator, no clean apology, no speech arranged around insight. Only the same man, thinning toward his end, sometimes gentler from fatigue, sometimes sharper for the same reason. Always translating feeling into function one more time before it reached language. Sarah came to hate that less. Not because it hurt less, because after a while the pattern became too consistent to dismiss as accident. One November morning, Williams called the house, looking for Walter, and got Sarah instead. Walter was in the backyard with a screwdriver, attempting to persuade a swollen gate latch to align with its strike plate. He missed his last palliative follow-up, Williams said. Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching Walter work the hinge. He had to pause twice, one hand braced on the fence, before straightening fully again. I know, she said. I can keep calling, Williams said, but I suspect you know the limits of that better than I do by now. Sarah looked at her father's bent back, the familiar line of concentration in his shoulders. Yeah, she said, I do. After she hung up, she carried a mug of coffee outside and set it on the patio table near him. He glanced at it, then at her. Bribery? Hydration. That is not what coffee is. It is in this house. He gave the gate latch another turn of the screwdriver. What did Williams want? You know what he wanted. Walter nodded as if she had confirmed something minor about the weather. Sarah stayed there instead of going back inside. The air smelled of damp leaves and cold wood. Somewhere beyond the fence, a leaf blower started up. Walter got the latch into place, tested it twice, then once more, because he never trusted the second test alone. You could still change your mind, she said. He did not look at her. I know. It was one of the last times she asked. Winter moved in. Eli went back to school. The rental in Bellevue became mostly a place where Walter kept shirts, files, and the clock parts he had not yet sorted. By January, he was at Sarah's more often than not. Mark, who understood territories better than either of them spoke about them, stopped pretending this was temporary, and cleared a second drawer in the downstairs bathroom without comment. There were evenings when the whole arrangement seemed almost ordinary. Walter at the table with a flashlight replacing batteries in the remote controls. Sarah grading essays with her glasses pushed up in her hair. Mark reading contractor estimates for the bathroom remodel they had been delaying. The television on, but ignored. Rain on the windows. A pot of rice steaming quietly in the kitchen. Those were the hardest evenings for Sarah, because then she could feel how survivable more time might have been. Not always noble time, not transformative time, just this. Rice, batteries, quiet corrections, her father, in the next room muttering at a stripped screw. 10 more years of this was too large and too painful a unit to handle directly, so she stopped measuring that way. Even 6 months felt greedy. Even another ordinary Thursday began to feel like something she should not trust while she still had it. Walter seemed, if not happier, then less driven. The panic that had launched the trip wore off somewhere between the Oregon coast and the repaired wall clock. He still kept the notebook, but he no longer checked it every day. Sometimes it sat on the guest room dresser for a week untouched. Sometimes she found it on the patio chair with a pen tucked inside and no new marks added. The list had ceased being an emergency route and become what it should perhaps have been from the start. A rough map of places where he had once brushed up against a life he had not fully known how to inhabit. He never said that. Sarah inferred it from the items themselves, from what he chose to finish and what he let remain undone. The watch repair stayed half complete in its tray because the magnifying lens hurt his eyes now and his hands cramped after 10 minutes. The old mushroom burger place had closed 3 years earlier, which should not have mattered and somehow did. One of Ellen's letters remained unmailed because he could not decide whether sending it late honored the past or tampered with it. Through all of this, item 12 stayed uncrossed. Tell Sarah I love her. Sarah saw it only once after Montana. He had left the notebook open by mistake on the patio table, and the page had lifted in the wind while she was carrying in the laundry. She stopped, saw the line still there, untouched, and felt first anger, then something sadder than anger, then embarrassment at herself for having hoped he might have solved it neatly in private. She put the notebook face down and did not mention it. In early March, the mornings began arriving a little earlier, with thin wet light and soil soft enough to smell alive again. The rosemary on the back patio had survived the winter. Sarah started leaving the kitchen door cracked on milder days while she packed her lunch for school. Walter was up before her that morning. She heard the kettle first, then the back door, then the faint scrape of one patio chair across concrete. By the time she came into the kitchen in her robe, the coffee was already made. One mug sat by the machine, the other was gone. She looked through the window. Walter stood by the herb pots in his old canvas jacket, the green hose in one hand, watering slowly at the base of each plant as if he meant to keep the water out of the leaves. The morning was cold enough that his breath showed when he turned his head. The sprinkler system had not started yet. The yard was quiet except for the soft rush from the hose and the small metallic tap where the nozzle knocked lightly against the rim of a pot. Sarah watched him longer than she intended. There was nothing symbolic in it while it was happening. Only her father in her backyard, doing something useful with a body already compromised. Exactly the kind of moment she had once overlooked because it looked too much like every other one. He'd bent to set the hose lower. Then he stopped moving. At first she thought the nozzle had snagged. Then he put one hand flat against the patio table, not dramatically, just firmly, as if steadying himself against a tilt in the ground. The hose slipped from his other hand and began watering the flagstones. Sarah was already moving before her mind had formed the full fact. By the time she reached the patio door, Walter had gone down to one knee, not collapsed, lowered almost. Then the second knee followed in a way no one would have chosen. His shoulder struck the chair on the way and knocked it sideways. Dad? The word came out louder than she intended and thinner than she wanted. She crossed the patio barefoot in seconds. The concrete was shockingly cold under her feet. Water from the hose spread across her robe hem and soaked into the knees as she dropped beside him. Walter was conscious. His eyes were open. One hand pressed hard into the center of his chest with the old engineer's disbelief that pressure, correctly applied, might alter outcome. I'm calling, she said. He shook his head once. Too bad. She fumbled for her phone with wet fingers. Mark was shouting from inside the house now, chairs scraping, the dog barking because everyone else was moving too fast. Sarah hit the emergency number and gave the address in a voice she did not recognize as hers. Walter's breathing was short and wrong, not frantic, constricted. His face had gone gray in a way human skin should not. He looked at her once, directly, and for a moment she thought, absurdly, traitorously, that now he might finally say it. What came instead was smaller. Turn off the hose, he said. Sarah made a noise that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. Mark was there then, kneeling on Walter's other side, taking the hose, shutting the spigot, asking questions the dispatcher was also asking. Walter did not answer most of them. His hand found the edge of Sarah's sleeve and held there, not tightly, only enough to keep contact. The ambulance came quickly, quicker than she would have believed, but not quickly enough to change the basic structure of the morning. At the hospital, they told her what she already knew by the way the paramedics had stopped moving with urgency and begun moving with procedure. A myocardial infarction, sudden, extensive. They had done what they could. Sarah signed forms with a pen that skipped on the glossy lines. Mark handled the phone calls. Eli drove back from campus that afternoon, arriving with his backpack still in the car, and his face stunned open in a way that made Sarah want to protect him, and could not. Williams called once, sounding more stricken than a doctor usually allowed himself to sound, and said he was sorry. The word landed gently and did not help. The funeral was small because Walter had arranged his life to make smallness easy. No dramatic procession of estranged relatives. A few old colleagues. Brian Harper from Spokane. Leah Chen, who came in a black coat and stood at the edge of the gathering with flowers wrapped in brown paper as if uncertain whether her role qualified her for grief. Mark, Eli, Sarah. A pastor Walter had once tolerated at Christmas services and would probably have objected to now, except objecting had ceased to be his work. It rained through most of the service. Afterward, people said the things people said when they were trying to honor a man who had not made honoring language especially simple. Dependable, capable, smart as hell. Quiet in the good way, mostly. There were stories about engines, about deadlines met, about the time he drove through a snowstorm to pick up a stranded coworker from SeaTac and never mentioned it later. Sarah listened and felt both seen and unseen by the composite they produced. It was him. It was not enough. It was all they had. 3 days later, when the casseroles had stopped arriving and the flowers had begun the transition from beautiful to managerial problem, Sarah found the notebook in the bottom drawer of the guest room dresser beneath a stack of folded t-shirts Walter no longer needed. She carried it to the patio and sat in the same chair where he had sat with it closed on his knees the night she had watched him through the sliding glass door. The yard was wet from recent rain. The rosemary needed trimming. One of the herb pots had cracked from cold and been taped temporarily at the base. The hose lay coiled beside the spigot, dry and unremarkable. Sarah opened the notebook. The pages smelled faintly of truck cab, old paper, and the peppermint gum Walter kept in his jacket pocket and never offered anyone because he believed people should bring their own. She read the list slowly this time, not as evidence, not as accusation, but as if reading the most literal version available of a man who had never learned to write himself in any richer form. Drive to Alaska. See the aurora borealis, crossed out. Eat breakfast at Dell's Diner and Talk, crossed out. Chain of hot springs, crossed out. Drive the Alaska Highway myself, crossed out. Glacier again, crossed out. Return Ed's tool chest to Brian Harper, crossed out. Sell the house clean, crossed out. Sort garage notes for Sarah, crossed out. Mail Ellen's letters to Ruth, not crossed out. See the Pacific from Highway 101 one more time, crossed out. Finish watch repair, not crossed out. Tell Sarah I love her, not crossed out. Sarah stared at the last line until the words blurred, then steadied again. For a moment, anger flashed up so suddenly it almost felt like relief. Even now, even after everything. He could mark 9 items complete, annotate motel exits, log pain episodes like a field report, and still leave this one sitting there like unfinished homework. Then she saw the writing beside it, smaller than the rest, wedged into the margin, almost hidden by the curve of the page. Not recent, she thought at first. Then she recognized the shakier hand from the later months. Said it, just not out loud. Sarah let out a sound that was not a cry because there was no one there to hear it right, and no clean note for it to land on. She put her fingers against the line, not touching the ink itself, only hovering over it as if proximity might yield clarification. It did not. There was no final release in the sentence, no guarantee, no retroactive repair. The note did not answer the question that had lived under all the others. Whether more years with her would ever have outweighed, to him, the terror of becoming weak and managed and dependent. It did not tell her when he had written it, or after what moment, or whether he had meant the coffee, the tires, the soup, the smoke detector, the gate latch, the hose bib, the years before that, or all of it stitched badly together. It only told her that he had known what the line meant, that he had stood near it, that he had, in his own insufficient language, considered it done. Sarah closed the notebook and sat with it in her lap. The backyard was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic softened by fences and wet air. A neighbor's wind chime knocked once and then not again. Somewhere inside the house, Mark was loading the dishwasher. She could hear the clink of plates through the open kitchen window. After a while, she stood and went to the spigot. The metal handle was cold and slightly rough under her palm. She turned it slowly. Water shuddered through the hose, then came alive. Sarah lifted the nozzle and watered the herb pots one by one at the base, the way he had done it, keeping the spray low, not wasting it on leaves. When she reached the place on the patio where he had gone down, she stopped. The concrete looked like any other concrete. There was no mark, only a darker seam where rainwater tended to collect. She let the water run over the rosemary a little longer than necessary. Then she stood there with the hose in her hand, listening to the steady pressure in the line, trying not to forgive exactly and not to solve anything, but to hear, in the plain, stubborn usefulness of the act, the language he had spent a lifetime speaking too poorly and too late.